Hello, strategic management students. Fred David here. I hope you're doing good today. I'd like to speak with you for a few minutes, if you don't mind, on global and international issues as impacting strategic management. Actually, I'm on chapter 11, starting chapter 11 here in the 17th edition. If by chance, if you have your book with you there, the 17th edition, I'm on page 322. I can see in that model on page 322, the lower horizontal line there reveals that global and international issues impact every activity that goes on with regard to strategic planning. Because you understand, about 95% of the world's population lives outside of the United States. And guess what? That group of folks outside the United States is growing. That population is growing 70% faster on average than the number of customers and so forth and people in the United States. So consequently, businesses and organizations and companies of all sizes are engaging more and more in trying to take advantage of customers globally that might be indeed interested in the product or service that you have to offer. And by engaging customers globally rather than just domestically or locally, a company or business organization can gain, as you know, economies of scale. In other words, potentially do more volume at a lower price. So we have businesses all the way from small mom and pop businesses with a website doing business globally to the large Deere and Campbell Soup and Heinz and Boeing doing business globally. So this chapter 11, our last chapter in the textbook, prior to the section on how to discuss, present, and prepare a case analysis, but this chapter 11 on global and international issues discusses the advantages and disadvantages of a firm engaging in operations and seeking customers globally, the drawbacks, the benefits. This chapter also talks about differences in organizational culture across countries. You realize managers can be much more effective by having awareness and knowledge and incorporating management differences across countries in their behavior and how they interact with customers, suppliers, distributors, even rival firms across the planet. This chapter also talks about differences in business climate across countries, which countries are let's say more corrupt than others, which ones are more favorable for doing business. So this chapter is important here in strategic management, our chapter 11. As I looked over on page 324, I see it where it says at the beginning to see and appreciate the world from the perspective of others has become a matter of survival for many businesses. So the variables that interact with regard to doing business on a global scale, obviously much more complex than on a local or domestic scale. Because, I mean, currencies vary, monetary systems vary, even laws vary. I mean, even accounting systems vary. The only really accounting country that uses the accounting system we use here in the United States, the International Financial Accounting Standards, are not used in other countries. They go with the International Financial Accounting Standards. So differences in culture, religious practices, laws, differences in laws and politics and so forth across countries and continents makes it much more difficult. But yet, as I said, 95% of our potential customers live outside of the United States. So that's why this chapter is important. I see on page 324 that here in the United States, we only export about 13% of our gross domestic product, compared with other countries such as 46% in Germany, roughly 20% in China, 172% in Singapore. What that is saying on the middle of page 324 is that there's a lot of room for growth in the United States in terms of doing business globally. Only 13% of what we produce is exported. So this chapter is going to focus on developing a global strategy, oftentimes is most effective for businesses. As I see on page 325, a global strategy includes designing, producing, and marketing products with global needs in mind, rather than considering just a home country, whether it's the United States or or Great Britain or South Africa or India or wherever. And it says there on page 325 that in whatever industry your business is competing in, it's a very risky posture actually to remain a domestic competitor, because more aggressive rival firms will use global growth to gain economies of scale and potentially offer the products and services that rival yours, offer them at a lower price. That's kind of the situation Hershey is in, for example, in the United States. You might know that Hershey derives about 89% of their revenue from the United States. Uh, Only 11% outside the United States. And of course, Hershey in the chocolate, candy, foods business. Don't you think folks around the world would enjoy Hershey products? So Hershey's rivals such as Nestle and Mars are gaining economies of scale on Hershey, offering with greater volume, offering similar products at a lower price. So as I'm looking on page 326, I see that it begins to talk about different variables that are important in a decision to do business globally, one of which is labor unions. I see at the bottom of page 326. You know, the average percent of our workforce in the United States that's a member of a labor union, it's about 11%. I see that on page 326. This compares with across Europe, the average being roughly 23%, led by countries such as Finland, with 74% of their employees being a member of a labor union. Roughly 70% of employees in Sweden are a member of a labor union. And this goes right on down towards 8% in Lithuania and France. So labor unions, that's an issue. That's one of many variables companies will consider in terms of deciding whether to build manufacturing facilities or stores or whatever in other countries. I see another variable are tax rates. I see on page 327 where obviously the United States has lowered its corporate tax rate to 21%, down from 37%, before the Trump administration took over. So that has really spurred tremendous economic development here, lowering our tax rate here in the United States to 21%. As compared to other countries, I see France on page 327 at 33%, Mexico at 30%, Germany at 30%, China at 25%, Singapore 17%, and some countries with 0% corporate tax rate, such as Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and Anguilla, the Turks, and the Caicos Islands. So tax rates vary dramatically across countries, and that's another variable that comes into play in companies' strategic decision deciding where to locate facilities and where to seek customers. Actually, page 327 and 328 are very important because I have an itemized list here of the major advantages and the major drawbacks of beginning or increasing your exposure or doing business outside of the United States. And certainly in terms of the advantages, at the very bottom of page 327, firms can gain new customers for their products. Firms can absorb excess capacity, reduce unit costs, spread economic risks over a wider number of markets. And then over on to page 328 there, you see the many benefits of doing business outside of the United States. But there are some drawbacks, as I see on page 328, some reasons why companies such as Hershey have been content historically pretty much with the bounty of plenty here in the United States. Look at those 6 reasons there, potential disadvantages. Foreign operations could be seized by nationalistic factions. Firms confront different and often little understood social, cultural, demographic, environmental, political, governmental, legal, technological, economic, and competitive forces when doing business internationally. So there's a whole range of variables that a company would need to become competent in terms of managing the situation doing business outside. Of course, number 4 there, language differs, monetary systems different, culture different, value systems different, laws different across countries. Political systems differ across countries. As we mentioned, accounting systems differ. And so there'd be a need to come up to speed on many variables to reap the advantages that are listed here on page 328. So that's where on page 329 I see there where it does talk about 95% of the world's population living outside the U.S. This group growing 70% faster than in the U.S. And that's why many of these companies listed there you see do business globally. Outsourcing and reshoring, outsourcing, very many potential benefits of outsourcing. I see on page 330, companies increasingly trying to take advantage of what different countries have to offer in terms of perhaps low labor rates or low tax rates and that kind of thing, and outsourcing various aspects of their operations. I see on table 11.3 on page 330, there are 11 potential benefits of outsourcing companies are engaging in. And in terms of reshoring, since the United States dropped the corporate tax rate to 21%, reshoring, that is companies bringing their operations, manufacturing facilities back to the United States or doing business here for the first time, has increased dramatically. I see 8 reasons, eight benefits for reshoring here on the bottom of page 330. Look, here in the United States laws protect female and minority employees, oftentimes much more so than countries on other continents. We have a very reliable energy at low cost here in the United States. Excess security to protect designs from overseas copycats, enable closer tabs on quality control and supply chains, less shipment costs. We have excellent human rights here, education, legal, and political systems. We promote freedom and opportunity for citizens, as well as the new 21% corporate tax rate. So those are some reasons I see on page 330 why companies that are potentially headquartered outside the United States are reshoring operations here or coming here for the first time. Now, folks, it's going to, in terms of organizational culture across countries, research suggests that to the extent a manager is aware of differences in culture across countries, that manager is going to be more effective in dealing with stakeholders, creditors, suppliers, rival firms, customers, and so forth across countries. And that's why we have this section here in chapter 11 on organizational culture. I see that it starts on page 330, goes on over to 331. Some cultural pitfalls that will help make you a better manager are here on table 11.4 on page 331. I see on page 331, for example, that managers from the United States place much greater emphasis on short-term results than do managers in other countries. Americans often refer to hourly employees, whereas, for example, in Japan, they'll refer to lifetime employees. And actually, Rose Knotts has done a considerable amount of research on this topic. I see her mentioned on the bottom of page 331 there. She says, Americans place an exceptionally high priority on time, viewing time as an asset and punctuality as vital. And some folks in other countries place much more worth on family and relationships. And punctuality is not that important in some other countries, such as Mexico, where punctuality is not nearly as big a deal as it is here in the United States. Even personal touching and distance norms differ substantially across countries. I see this on the bottom of page 331. So being aware of these types of differences in culture, in business culture across countries can make you much more effective and be that much more helpful for the organization. I see on page 332, number 5, many cultures around the world value modesty, team spirit, collectivity, and patience much more than competitiveness and individualism, which are so important in the United States. And also, number 8, there, Americans do business with individuals they do not know, unlike business persons in many other countries. In Mexico and Japan, for example, having some type of relationship is almost mandatory before doing business with the person. So cultural differences and communication differences across countries. I see on the bottom of page 332, for example, in Japan, most managers are reserved, quiet, distant, introspective, and others-oriented. Compared to the United States managers, just in general, are much more talkative, insensitive, impulsive, direct, and individual-oriented. And so unlike Japanese managers, I see there on the bottom of page 332, U.S. managers often use blunt criticism, ask prying questions, make quick decisions. So these kinds of communication differences, being aware and knowledgeable of these differences and taking them into consideration as you interact with managers, employees, and so forth across countries can help you be much more effective. And then on page 333, we began discussion of several countries and how the culture compares in that country. Business culture we're talking about compares to the United States. The first one is Mexico. So I see on page 333, it starts right off talking about, well, Mexico is basically an authoritarian society in terms of schools, churches, businesses, and families. In general, employers seek workers who are agreeable, respectful, and obedient, rather than innovative, creative, and independent. You see that on page 333? So just one variable in terms of participative management style that we are so accustomed to here in the United States. Throughout Mexico, that's not what employees typically expect. Is a paternalistic type environment, almost like parents, where the employer takes care of them with sick leave and family days and food baskets maybe and so forth. And they don't really expect to take part in strategic decision making, just in general in Mexico. So I see that on page being talked about on page 333. Then on page 334 at the top says U.S. business embodies individualism, achievement, competition, curiosity, pragmatism, informality, spontaneity, and doing more than is expected on the job. Whereas in Mexico, businesses generally stress collectivism, continuity, cooperation, belongingness, formality, and doing exactly what is told. And meeting times for appointments are not rigid. Tardiness is common in Mexico. So these kinds of variations across countries, not being knowledgeable of these is why this material is included here in chapter 11. Then I see a discussion about Japan. That, for example, in terms of the business culture in Japan, it says here the Japanese people place great emphasis on group loyalty and consensus, a concept called wa. Group activities in Japan encourage wa among managers and employees. And also in Japan, a person's age and status are very important, much more so here than in the United States. So whether in the family unit or extended family or in social business situation. So school children in Japan learn really early in life to really honor the older, the elderly, much more so here than in the United States. So I see a discussion on page going into page 335 about the business culture situation in China, business culture situation and in India, just as a sampling of countries, just to reemphasize the need to, before doing business in different countries across different continents, to gain some understanding of how business culture varies across the country. Then we start a discussion of business climate across countries. I see on page 336, there's some research that indicates what's the best countries on various continents for doing business, just in terms of business climate. I see New Zealand is the best overall. Look at where the United States is, actually below the United Kingdom. United Kingdom number 7, United States number 8, followed by Sweden. So this is on page 336, table 11.5. So there's a need to gain an understanding of the overall business climate in various countries. That's one variable also that enters into a decision to build operation, begin building stores and manufacturing facilities, or just seek customers from other countries. Africa, I see being discussed on page 333, coming very much online, infrastructure being built more and more and more daily. Look at that, about 30 African countries are now considered democracies. Currencies in Africa are stabilizing, and many countries are fundraising to build modern highways, ports, and power grids. This is across Africa. So there are millions, billion customers in Africa that potentially could be interested in buying whatever product or service your business is offering. So that's why there's a discussion here of Africa. I see on page 337 a discussion of the business climate in China. It says right off the bat there, China is the world's most populous country, and China's economic output annually exceeds the United States. So hundreds of companies are scurrying to set up business in China. And so I see a discussion also about Indonesia, a democratic Pacific archipelago comprised of thousands of islands. Indonesia is growing rapidly. Their currency is a rupiah, and its economy is one of the fastest growing in Asia. So that Indonesia is another outstanding country, potentially based on its business climate, to seek customers from. I see discussion of India. And finally, on page 338, this chapter concludes discussing Mexico again, not in terms of culture this time, but in terms of business climate. And Mexico, I see right there that Mexico's exports and production of vehicles were up 12% in this past year. In 2020, Ford's new electric vehicle manufacturing plant in Quetzaltenango, Mexico, is going to be completed. Foreign direct investment in Mexico has surged to exceed 30 billion annually. So Mexico, a booming place to booming business climate there, as a place to set up operations, manufacturing facilities, or to seek customers from Mexico. So the bottom line with Chapter 11, folks, is that I go back to the 95% of the world's population living outside the United States, and that group growing 70% faster than us here in the United States, means there's a lot of potential customers out there for whatever food or whatever product you sell, from Hershey to Boeing, whatever your product or service. There's a lot of potential customers out there that could enable you to gain economies of scale, which will enable you to offer your products and services that have larger volume, offered at a lower price, to stay and remain competitive and to gain competitive advantages. And as you recall from earlier chapters, gaining and sustaining competitive advantage really all the way up and down the value chain, from raw materials all the way up through the end customer, gaining and sustaining competitive advantage all the way up and down that value chain. Companies are seeking global competitive advantages. So that's why this chapter is important to consider in developing a comprehensive strategic plan. Folks, I appreciate you joining with me here on Chapter 11 today. I'm going to speak with you in just a few minutes here about presenting and analyzing a strategic management case. That's the last little section here, part 6 in the 17th edition. But this concludes our 11 chapters that have focused on the process of strategic planning. I hope you've enjoyed reading these, learned a lot. I hope many of these skills you've now acquired from these first 11 chapters, you'll even consider including several of them on your resume as having gained competence in performing SWOT analysis, or performing QSPM analysis, or performing projected financial statement analysis. These are skills that are valued immensely in the workplace. And so I'm hoping you are comfortable including some of those now in your resume. Nice to see you. Take care. We'll see you soon.